Hello, I'm Stephen Hurley, and welcome to Focus on Well-Being on the EdCan network. With over 125 years of experience as a leading independent national voice in Canadian K-12 education, the Canadian Education Association has recently launched the EdCan network to support the thousands of courageous educators working tirelessly to ensure that all students discover their place, their purpose, and their path. And that tradition continues as this year we tackle what is arguably one of the most discussed topics affecting the lives of our students, our educators, and the support staff that learn and work each day in Canada's schools and classrooms. Well-Being, A Key to Success takes place in Toronto on October 5th and 6th and promises to explore solutions for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous schools. Today on the podcast, it's Dean Shareski. He's an educator. He's the community manager for Discovery Education Canada. He's the author of a very popular book, Embracing a Culture of Joy, and we're pleased to announce that Dean will be one of our keynote speakers at this year's EdCan Network Symposium, Well-Being, A Key to Success. Dean Shareski, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here, Stephen. Always great to talk with you.
Yeah, well, it's been a while since we've seen each other face to face, but I keep track of what you're doing, and it's a very active and, as you'd probably admit, fulfilling life. Tell us a little bit about what you're up to now.
Yeah, so this the role of community manager, again, it's one of those obscure titles that means nothing to most people, but it means a lot to me, and it means a lot to the work that we do across Canada and as well as our larger team that is in the U.S. and the U.K. So Discovery Education works with around 40 or 50% of all schools in North America, a little bit less in Canada, but certainly growing all the time. And so my role, along with my colleagues who share a similar position, is really just to our motto is connecting educators to their most valuable resource, which is each other. And so anything that we can do that builds that community, that creates a sense of belonging, not only to the work that we do at Discovery and other educators, but even within their own districts. It's amazing how often we become the conduits for building community within school districts. And so through events and through the use of our products and through almost anything, social media, online activities, we work to really connect educators with one another. So it's a broad mission for sure, but certainly one that I think is much needed.
Now, when you and I first met, you weren't involved with Discovery Education. You were doing other things. But you don't come to this conversation about school culture without a whole lot of experience and a whole lot of insight. Tell us what you were doing before that. Life before Discovery.
Well, I worked in a school district in Saskatchewan for almost 24 years as a teacher, classroom teacher for most of that, and the latter part of that working at the district level. And so, my wife is an educator, my father-in-law is an educator, so it's one of those common stories of kind of living this world pretty thoroughly. And so it was just this, and you talk about, Stephen, the time that we first met. And ironically enough, when we first met, I had just come back from an interview with Discovery Education. So I was I had not yet decided whether I was going to leave that school district. But we met as part of that Unplugged event in Northern Ontario. What are we talking now, 6 years ago?
Well, I think it was 2011, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
And, that was really a kind of a reflective time for me, because one of the things that we were tasked with, and again, just to give people a context, there were around 40 educators from across Canada who were and are still some of the most connected people. And these were people who, had connected because of their use of online spaces and tools. And yet when we came together as a group, we unplugged and we were looking at the the key questions around what matters in education. And I love telling your story because, in essence, you're fulfilling your dream of radio and doing this thing that I remember you being so passionate about. And the thing I was passionate about that really was crystallized during that event was the whole idea of joy, and really being explicit about why isn't that more an important conversation? And why is that just sort of this, well, that's nice when that happens, but that's not really what education is about. And that bothered me. And so it was through that event and, lots of reflection and writing since then that I've really become to believe with all my being that joyful learning and a joyful environment is something that we cannot simply hope happens or see as a nice but not necessary cultural pursuit. So I guess that's where it started, and of course, lots of little things along the way that sort of, made me continue to believe that was an important thing. But that was a big moment for me to kind of understand that we got to do something, and we got to be serious about this.
Well, it was that whole experience, the unplugged experience, was a turning point for a lot of people. And you're right about the connectivity, and you're right about living the dreams. That's the weekend that I discovered the precursor to my life here on Voice Ed Radio. And so that was a joyful, exhilarating time. But to some ears, the word joy may sound a little, and I hate the word soft, but I'm going to use it anyways because that is maybe what people will refer to it as. What do you mean by joy? Is it just a general sense of well-being, or is it? Well,
it is, and it's also it is also. I mean, if people want to get into a data or hard. Rather than a soft position, it's really the expression and the evidence of that well-being. So it's one thing to talk about, student well-being, which is an amazing and important conversation. But joy, in my mind, is people talk about it as sort of an internal sense. Yes, it is, but it expresses itself in outward ways. In visible ways. And that's the part that I'm really curious to explore, because I'm looking for a wide variety of that evidence. And certainly the easy ones to see are, kids just sort of this idea of engagement and kids being excited about learning, which is definitely part of that. And of course you can envision how that manifests itself. But then there's also this idea of joy when people are just sort of fully immersed in learning. And sometimes that's not always, a smile, happy kind of experience, but it's really, it can be intense, but also really joyful when kids are working at those, deep problems or trying to solve an issue, or teachers just engaged in really hard conversations. That can be joyful too. And so I think what I'm passionate about, I'm trying to do is tease out what that looks like. And more importantly, what is it that we do as leaders and as classroom teachers to ensure more of those kinds of things happen? So the cultural emphasis around, how do we design spaces that are joyful? How do we create, opportunities for those things to happen?
So we all have experience of those joyful moments, maybe in our teaching, maybe in our learning, maybe in our home life, maybe somewhere in the community. But you talk in the book that you wrote about embracing a culture of joy. So how is a culture of joy, how is it different than those individual discrete experiences of joy? And what does it mean to embrace and nurture a culture of joy? How do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, simply the key word there is intention. Joyful things happen spontaneously, and wow, that was great that happened. But I'm looking and sort of encouraging people to be reflective around why did that happen. So if those indeed are the moments, if those are the kinds of things you want to see, then what is it that you can do to create more of those kinds of moments. And so in the book, and again, I'm really clear about the fact that, listen, there are a myriad of ways to accomplish that, and I simply shared some of the ways that I've seen and experienced in my own practice, and seen in others that have created cultures of joy where that's just the way that things are. So, I mean, I talk a lot about gratitude, for example. Having, and I recently, that was actually a republish of a Boulder blog post on Solution Tree, where my book is published, where I just talked about my experience with Discovery Education, which was another one of these aha moments. School districts are filled with very good people, wonderful people, but I don't think that in most districts gratitude is a prized and intentional part of what they do. With Discovery Education, granted, I'm working primarily with I work with probably 20 to 25 people on a pretty regular basis. But to a person, gratitude is embedded in that culture. We never finish off any kind of a meeting, conversation without, and I'm not talking about a thank you at the end, thanks for coming. I'm talking about explicit acknowledgments of the work that you're doing. Hey, I really appreciated the way you handled this situation. You really dealt with this well. Those kinds of things, that is just part of what they do. Every time we're together, there's this, hey, I heard you did this job over here. I want to say how much I appreciate that. So, I don't know, it was just bizarre to me that I came from an education environment to a corporate environment where this deep sincerity of thank you was there. So that's just an example of it's about intention, and you don't do that unless everyone's doing it. And so now all of a sudden you feel like, boy, I better. This is just, I guess, the way we operate, the way we treat one another. And so I guess this becomes part of the culture. So that's just an example, but There's lots of other kinds of things. I talk about play a lot. I talk about just community in general. There's a number of ideas where that's what I'm getting at is how do you be intentional about ensuring that those things are just part of the practice.
Well, you've got my mind spinning as many of our listeners will be preparing for those first days back to school and thinking about the culture, not only of their classroom, but in respect to formal school leaders, administrators, vice principals, how they might do things a little bit differently this year. So that culture doesn't just happen one teacher walking into a class and deciding to embrace it and make it part of the way they do things. I can imagine that at staff meetings, at professional learning activities, that there are practices and habits of mind and routines that are necessary for this to become part of the drinking water of a school community. Where have you seen some of the greatest successes in people taking your advice and attempting to embrace this culture of joy?
Well, I mean, there's probably a lot of examples. There's two things that just come to mind. One that's very relative to the Canadian context, and one that I just recently experienced. So in the Canadian context, one of my portfolios, ironically enough, when I was working at the school district in Saskatchewan, was First Nations and Métis education. And I might be as far from First Nations and Métis as you can imagine. And so it was a real learning experience for me for understanding their culture. And I remember going to a meeting at the ministry, and this actually happened more than once, where the meeting was intended to start at 9 o'clock. And we get there at 9 o'clock, and everyone was there. And instead of diving into the agenda, people started asking about your families and so forth. And I thought this was a little bit strange because, yeah, there were some people that knew one another more than others, but we really got into this, and for people that are used to having a lot of meetings, you get on with it, right? Like, where's the agenda? And I remember the First Nations leader in this case talking about the fact that, listen, if we're going to spend the better part of a day with one another, why wouldn't we take the time to get to know one another? And so that was a real cultural awakening that was about intention, right? That said that we're taking the first few minutes of this meeting just to talk. And another example of that, I think about the whole idea of just mindfulness. And I was in this classroom in Singapore a number of years ago, And it was a high school teacher who started every classroom, an English teacher, with tea. Kids came in, the lights were turned down, and they made them. So there was tea in the back of the classroom. They poured themselves a cup of tea, and for 5 minutes, they just sat and drank their tea quietly, or talked. But it was nothing about the coursework until there was this chance to kind of just settle a bit. And I just thought that was just such a brilliant, simple but brilliant way of saying this is how that we're going to work together.
So when I can think of a whole bunch of things that might stand in the way of this happening, but I want to maybe zero in on one or two of the conditions that you have found when you point people to this cultural thing called joy. What are some of the conditions that you've found actually help to nurture that on a larger scale?
It absolutely has to start with leadership, just taking a stand that this is a priority. And so simply making that statement, acknowledgement that I want to pursue this, is where that begins. And again, there's a number of ways that you can address it. I'm continuing to find more and more ways that we do that. And I think the other condition, and I think this is true with a lot of things in education. We hear a lot about, when we talk about things like innovation, you hear the term pockets of innovation, right? You go to a school district, and every school district in the world will tell you, oh, we have pockets of great things happening, but they're trying to, quote unquote, scale.
Yeah.
And they're frustrated by this. So one of the things that I always invite people to do is take an inventory. What are the things that you're already doing? You don't even know you're doing really, really well, or pursuing, that are on the path to joy, to innovation, to whatever a sort of goal you have set for yourself. And I think people will often find, wow, that we actually do some of these things. We just haven't either A, called them out, or B, develop some intention and strategy around making sure that this happens on a regular, consistent basis. So I don't know that it's always about coming up with something new or really transforming. It's about saying, well, wait a minute, we actually do this thing. And teachers are just because of the nature of their role, sometimes really bad at identifying their own strengths and the things that they're doing, because their life is and their classes are so filled with activity that they maybe don't have time to reflect. But when they do, they realize, oh yeah, I remember when I did this thing for that kid, and the face lit up. And it's just about taking the time to say, okay, well, let's expand further. Let's see if there's a way in which you can make that embedded into practice. So I think it's probably not as far off as people think. So I think there's something about thinking about your strengths and thinking about what you're already doing. And then, because once you do that, and once you sort of set aside, okay, so let's say it's the tea thing with the teacher. Well, that's easy to do. So once I do one thing, the chance of you then doing two or three things to continue to foster that kind of culture, I think, is well within reach. Yeah,
and you hit on something, I think, which I would classify as an important condition, and that is the time, and taking that time. And you've created in our minds a type of virtuous circle here that that begins with gratitude, and as soon as that circle is put in motion, then people will likely be more reflective of their own situations, their own contexts, and I have a feeling that things will just, well, we could say snowball, and as you say, that's true with anything, whether it's innovation, whether it's joy, whether it's a greater sense of mindfulness. So I think you've hit on a few really good conditions that we often hear are important in the change narrative in education, and I appreciate you bringing those forward. And I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. You're coming to Toronto October 5th and 6th. You are the keynote speaker for Day 2, October 6th, at the Wellbeing and Focus on Wellbeing Symposium from the EdCan network.
Well, I mean, I feel really fortunate to be on the board of directors for the EdCan network, and it sort of is a nice way of me contributing back to the work they're doing by speaking. As far as the topic itself goes, I think, when you touched on I think we are all struggling with the idea of, well, this seems like a soft thing. Like, well, how does well-being match up to big goals of student achievement, which again is a loaded term that I always invite people to say, tell me more about what you mean by student achievement, because it can be very people. So I think just the complexity of the topic, the timeliness of the topic, I think makes it a really, really important thing. It's because it is difficult to assess, unlike the way in which we've previously assessed learning, which was purely by test scores and very, very quantitative measures. The fortunate part is I think we're getting better. I mean, Ontario is certainly leading the way by including it in their ministry documents that this is indeed a goal we have to address. That said, it's still a real challenge. And so I think by taking and having a conference devoted to that and having a variety of speakers, me just being one of them, who will just work at this. Again, I am not coming to people with any answers. Specifically, I hope I challenge people more. And one of the things, I guess, specifically that I want to challenge people and think about, and this will sort of be the framework that my talk will be about, is sometimes it's not about balance. That's always the default thing. When people ask questions, well, should school be hard or should school be fun? Should we teach kids how to read, or should we teach them the love of reading? And those are the kinds of questions that I don't know that they are pure binary questions, which sometimes they're laid out to be. But I do think it matters what we emphasize first and what we lead with. And so I think sometimes it's about making hard choices that says, you know what? Yeah, we have a lot of things that we're tasked with doing with education, but sometimes we got to choose. And we got to say, here's how we're leading this conversation. Yeah, we're going to try to do all these other things too, which are important. But culture is what you are about and what you say, this matters more than that. And again, it's not to the exclusion of the other things we have to do. But I think sometimes it's time for us to make a choice and say, this is where we're starting with this conversation. This is what we want to start with. And I think reading is a great example. I firmly believe that we need to start with teaching kids to love to read, not by teaching them how to read. That will come first. And again, both are important. You have to have both. But it matters what we lead with. And I think that's true in a lot of cases. So that's what I'm going to challenge people with my talk. And again, I think there's a lot of other great sessions and opportunities for people to continue to dive in and develop their own strategies and ideas, and really this idea of community, connecting everyone to their valuable resource, one another, is what an event like this is all about.
So the symposium, once again, October 5th and 6th at the Airport Holiday Inn in Toronto. Be sure to visit edcan.ca/wellbeing for more information, including registration details, a full list of sessions, and bios on all of our speakers, including today's guest, Dean Shareski. Dean, thanks again for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Stephen. Looking forward to chatting more.
Yeah, we'll see you in October. I'm Stephen Hurley, and this is the EdCan Network on Voice Ed Radio. Your voice is right here.